Hello, everyone. This is Sebastian from the European Campaign Playbook. Welcome today to our regular weekly digital lunch. This one very special. We have with us Eve Zuckerman, who is going to join me on the screen in a second.
Hi.
There she is. Hi, Eve. How's it going?
Hi, I'm great. How are you?
All good, all good. You can see, get here with the Christmas tree, the chimney. So it's a special time of the year. We're making it special. So the idea of the meeting today, right, is very straightforward. We hear it a lot. Our family, friends, they say politicians lie. Politicians, whilst they are in the campaign trail, they say whatever they want. They need to say to get into government. Once they are in government, then they completely forget about the promises. They completely ignore it. Only when until the next campaign is back. And as we as campaigners, we as campaign staffers, we are part of that. Most of us work in campaigns, support our candidate, our political party. Only a few of us, however, make it to government. And the good thing is that today with us, we have Eve, who is someone who has had that experience. She's been in the campaign trail for a long time, but she also was advising no other than France Premier Minister, Edouard Philippe. And that's the whole idea of having you on board to have a chat about a few issues. Some housekeeping rules. We will. There are people who are waiting on the to join us from the European Campaign Playbook community. Don't worry. As when we start the Q&A session, I will bring you to the screen, and you will be able to ask your questions to Steve. I can see Simon and Dominic. And for those of you who are following on social media, as you know, drop your questions on the comment sections of YouTube, Twitter, or YouTube, and then I'll bring them to Eve when they become relevant. So with that in mind, that's our agenda for today. Let's start with Eve. Tell us a little bit about you.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be able to talk about my experience and looking forward to hearing questions, comments from other professionals in the field. A little bit about me. So I am French and American. Got my start, as many others, in 2012 while I was studying in Chicago. And I worked on the Obama campaign, the Obama re-election campaign, which was really the first time, especially coming from France, that I saw the power of digital and data to engage the biggest number of people possible in the political and democratic process. And so I specialized in digital organizing and digital organizing tools. And very rapidly, it became my job to bring back those methods of engagement using digital back to France. And the first time I did that was as the digital director for Alain Juppé. Alain Juppé is one of the former prime ministers of France, who ran for president in 2016 in what was the first ever primary for the center-right, for what was the UMP and which is now called Les Républicains. And so my job was to invent, basically, in France, how do you, starting from scratch, having no file, no data, no grassroots volunteers, no structure, because you don't have the party helping you, and you are starting from nothing for a primary. How do you engage thousands and thousands and thousands of volunteers to turn out millions of voters in the first ever primary? So I did that for a year and a half. Made it to the second round, where we lost it to François Fillon. And then what happened next was a big surprise for a lot of us, which obviously you were talking about going from campaigning to covering. It was not a straight line for our team. We lost in 2016, and then what happened was Emmanuel Macron obviously was elected president and named as his prime minister Edouard Philippe, who was one of the closest political allies, obviously, to Alain Juppé. And Edouard Philippe brought this team with him to the prime minister's office. So not a straight line, going from a political defeat and a very long, hard-fought campaign for almost 2 years, to then becoming part of the political advisors team surrounding the prime minister for 3 years and 3 months. And I now work for France Digital, which is the #1 organization for startups, as the communications and marketing director.
Okay, that was very, very, very concise, very, very clear for everyone to get to know your background, what you came from. To me, it's particularly interesting that the two things. Like, first one, that you brought all the insights, all the knowledge, all the innovation from the States over to no other country than France, which is I remember France back in 2016 having this discussion about data, digital organizing. It mustn't have been easy. So I want to hear a little bit more about that, and also, of course, the election night is not, even if you are on the losing side, it's not the end. There is always a way out, and for you, there was probably you would have been able to have this position. Well, who knows, no? But tell us more about this difference between the States and Europe.
So that's actually a really interesting question. Obviously, we've followed, especially this year. We know what a presidential election looks like in the U.S. I see 3 main differences that are really important to keep in mind when we're talking about bringing over, experience in organizing and digital organizing the U.S. to Europe. The first, obviously, is regulation. When it comes to France specifically, one of the biggest differences is it is illegal to advertise 6 months prior to the election date. And obviously, when you see, how elections, the way campaigns are built in the U.S. are mostly built around fundraising, and the digital programs that you build out are very focused on online fundraising, and that's also a big role for the digital communications teams. So very different approach in France. The other, obviously, is the budget. I think I saw from another acronym newsletter, which is a great newsletter actually to follow. It's about digital organizing among Democrats. Another acronym, who was saying that just for Facebook, and I think it was around October, from until October, the Trump campaign had spent like $150 million just on Facebook advertising, when you know that in France, the cap for a presidential election is more around 22 million euros. So incomparable budgets. That's the second thing. The third, obviously, is data privacy. The way you use data is very different. A very simple example that I would use is data protection rules in France make it so, a campaign, if you're constituting a data file for a campaign, data files are supposed to have a specific goal and expiration date. So you would have to destroy that file at the end of the campaign, which is obviously not the way that data is used in political parties in the U.S. And the last difference I would add is staff. In 2012, the Obama campaign reached 2.2 million volunteers, but that was built also with thousands of people who were on staff and paid to reach specific organizing goals. In France, at least, the structures of campaigns are very different and are 95 or 99% volunteer, even at the highest levels of the campaign. That said, to your point about, you know, how did it happen? How did it work? Trying to import some of the culture and mindset and techniques learned in political campaigns in the U.S. to France. I think the first thing was to come into a campaign, well, obviously, you know, for a candidate that I deeply believed in, but also that really had a profound interest, you know, from the get-go in modernizing the ways that the leadership of that campaign had been used to campaigning. So it was coming from the leadership at the very beginning, very early on. There was a very strong interest in building upon expertise that had happened in the US in order to build out the strategy for the primary. And I think the primary, kind of like COVID now, actually forced you into innovation simply because it was the very first time. Usually, you know, starting for a presidential campaign in France, you would be the official candidate for your political party. So you would start with elected officials everywhere on the ground, local elected officials. You would have volunteers. You would have heads of local federations ready to support your campaign. You would have local political influencers. So all of that infrastructure would have already been built for you by the time you announced your candidacy. In a primary for the first time, you had none of that. So you were forced to think outside the box. And I think it's, we'll come back to it probably, but I think there's a lot of parallels with COVID and the way people have had to reinvent campaigning, because you can't use, you know, the techniques that you've been using for 30 years, you know, be it door knocking or handing out leaflets at the market. You have to think differently when you don't have access to face-to-face contact. So that was really the first thing. It was a strong will on the part of the campaign leadership to bring me in. I was the second full-time recruit. So the first was the fundraising director and the second was the digital director, which I think said a lot about where the priorities of the campaign were. And that gave me a lot of room, I think, to innovate and to participate early on to how the campaign was built. So that doesn't mean that it was easy or that there wasn't resistance. And I think, you know, this was, you know, a couple of years back already. So when it came to, at a volunteer level all across the country, having to really put into place, you know, what you could call a culture of data, which looks very different in a French context than it would in the US. And something simple that I would share on that point is simply to say, you know, if you're training volunteers everywhere in the country, to have a discourse that very simply stated, okay, we're heading into a very long campaign. We're a year and a half out. And the role we want to give you is any time that you are making contact with a potential voter, and here are the ways that you can make contact, and here are the ways that you can, you know, recruit other volunteers. But any way you make contact, anytime you make contact with a potential voter, your role, you know, metaphorically, is to take him or her by the hand and hold on to his hand for a year and a half, giving him or her, you know, constantly new ways of engaging with that campaign, of staying engaged, and of increasing their role in and their relationship with the campaign until election day, where not only are they a voter, but that they will have turned out, you know, other voters within their circle, or even taken on a volunteer leadership role in the campaign. So I think one of the biggest principles that I, you know, helped bring back in our campaign was that of the ladder of engagement, which was to say, you know, think ahead as to what are the different ways that your volunteers can engage with your campaign, and always keep moving forward. What is, how can you move them from maybe they've just clicked on your website, or they've retweeted you, or they've already given you like 10 years. How do you keep coming back to them with a new opportunity for engagement that is at the same time personalized and appropriate? Don't go asking for 500 euros for somebody who just retweeted you, for example, but to always be at the correct level, and keep giving them new opportunities for engagement, which I think was specific, really important for us, given that it was a very long campaign and that we had very specific goals as to how we were going to build out our volunteer infrastructure. Around what we had were volunteer committees, and the way you could sign up for them was we had a whole online platform where you could request to be a volunteer a committee leader, basically. At which point we would give you access to resources. Well, we would onboard you, but then we would give you access to resources to grow, to engage your own personal network, but also grow your network of volunteers locally around your perimeter or where you were based. And so to have that culture of data was really really important to input right at the start of the campaign and across volunteer trainings. And what that meant, when you say, okay, what does that mean concretely? One of the simple things we did was, okay, anytime you're having a conversation with a potential voter, are you asking him or her for their phone number, for their email? How are you keeping them in touch? How are you building up a file of potential volunteers that you can mobilize and keep growing, and then identify on that basis future volunteer committee leaders that you can then entrust with their own responsibilities, and they can in turn recruit volunteers around them, which loosely resembles the Obama snowflake model, which they implemented also in his campaigns. So that just gives you a couple examples of what that meant. But obviously, it wasn't necessarily always easy. Maybe one last point on that, to come in and to tell people, who have been campaigning, maybe some for 30 or 40 years, always in the same place, in the same way. They have their habits, which is to go and hand out leaflets again at the market, or go knock on doors in no particular order, or not following any specific logic, and to come in and to say, okay, well, we're going to use these new tools to help you build out in the long term a team of volunteers around you. And the real turning point, I would say, was when they saw the proof of it working. When you have a first political rally and you can calculate that about 60% of the people in the room at that political rally actually came from people that you had met previously, maybe 6 months prior, but because you had kept in touch, because you had kept them regularly informed and engaged with the campaign, they showed up and filled that room for you on the day of that rally. And that was really good proof of what it meant and what it brought for people, even those who had been volunteering for years and years, to be able to include new tools and data in the way that they were campaigning. So a long response to a short question, but I hope that gives you some insight as to how we were working.
I think it was great, because it's actually one of the articles on which we are working on with one of the members, which is and that's why I brought it up, because it's a question that we're often asked. Before we move on to the next item in the agenda, I'm gonna say hi to those who join us, who are gonna join us on camera. So Simon and Denesh, I'm gonna bring you up here. Dominique, I can't see your screen, so I won't until you are ready. But so this is Simon. Hi, Simon.
Hi. Thanks Thanks a lot, Yves, for joining. Very interesting.
Hi.
Please, Simon, tell us a little bit about you so that Eve also gets to know you.
Thanks a lot. Sorry, I just had to close the door here. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Simon. I work at the ECB in Frankfurt, where I lead a little team of digital analytics experts. So it seems like we're working on very similar things as you did back in the campaign, Yves, but on the institutional side rather than the political side. So we're also looking at how we can engage European citizens, explain what we do, and of course, in turn, build trust.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Nice. Thanks, Simon. And now I'm gonna bring Dinesh.
Hey, salut.
Hi.
Hola, Sebastián. Sziasztok.
Hi.
Well, merci beaucoup. Muchas gracias. Köszönöm. Thank you very much for your insights. As you may know, this Sunday there will be parliamentary elections in Romania, and I work for EPP Group MEP Laurent Vince from the Democratic Alliance of Hungarians in Romania, but we also have a colleague watching who is from USR Plus, from Renew Europe. And there's a high probability that one or both of these parties are going to enter into government. So I wanted to ask Yves, could you highlight one best practice, tactic or technique, tool that you learned while you were in government that you would have loved if Yves, who was just entering into government, would have known, so that these parties can learn from that?
Yeah, I think so. This might be a little specific to working for the head of government, which was our case, and a little context about French institutions. You obviously have the president, and under him you have the head of government, chef du gouvernement, the prime minister, and a huge part of the role of the prime minister is actually to coordinate and oversee and lead the government team. You could have up 30 or 40 ministers, each in their own domain, and it's up to you to coordinate them and to make decisions, the arbitrage, if two or more members of government are in disagreement or have different views, to make those calls and to make those decisions. But that's also true for communications. And I think, what I maybe didn't have in mind coming in, but that became incredibly important and a huge part of my role, and obviously the role of our communications team, was coordinating and thinking ahead in terms of who speaks and when. And that doesn't only mean members of government, but as the head of government, it also means the relationship with the parliamentary majority, the relationship with the political party. So I guess from an organizational standpoint, one of the first pieces of advice I would give is make sure absolutely from the get-go who your interlocutors are, in different ministries or political teams, in parliament, in the political party, and the other major centers of influence that they are, because the first thing that you can control when it comes to political communications, or at least that you can try to control, is your own, from your own majority and your own side, making sure that everybody is coordinating and not hurting your own communications sequence moments. So obviously there's everything else that's going to happen. You can't necessarily predict a crisis, etc., anything that would be an external phenomenon. But at the very least, what you can do is make sure that you're running a tight ship, and who's in charge of coordinating the different spokespeople on your side. So that was a really important step, I would say, here. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much indeed. That was a lot of great ideas. Thanks. I'll pass it on, and may the best one win.
There you go.
Good. Okay, so if you want, Simon and Denesh, I can give you here if you want to say something or intervene, just unmute and feel free to join the conversation. What I had in mind is now that we have known it a little bit better, let's talk about the next topic, the difference between campaign and governing, which I think we've touched upon briefly. And I would like to start with a quote that I came across reading a really good book, which is that one. It's campaigning is what you do to get the chance to govern. You say what you have to say, but the true test is what comes afterwards. And it's from the man who ran Washington. It's a biography on James Baker, who was everything you could be in U.S. politics. So my question perhaps is I will start with that. No, you being campaigning, you being in government. What are the main differences that you've experienced?
I would say, first of all, it's very cliche, but you could say bureaucracy. So obviously on a campaign, as far as I'm concerned, I was the head of my own team, and everything was extremely streamlined. So everybody's working in the same space. The team is not huge. There were about 15 of us that were working full time, and then you obviously had thousands of volunteers to coordinate. But it could easily, test and innovate. Test and learn and innovate and try new things. At least on the digital organizing side. I would say working for the campaign of a former prime minister who was campaigning ahead in the polls for basically the entire campaign, apart from the last 3 weeks, we obviously had to be more careful than if you were the dark horse or a runner-up, because you want to lose that lead, so that puts you kind of in a different mindset. But generally speaking, you have a lot of space to innovate and to do things yourself. Coming into government, I think our biggest surprise, and also it really had a big impact on my role and the way I worked was the way it works is you have a team of advisors that surround the prime minister. There's about 60 advisors. Everybody is specialized on their own topic. You have your transportation advisor, you have your environmental advisor, et cetera, and then you have your political advisors that work in communications and obviously managing your schedule, relationship with the parliament, with elected officials. So I was on the communications team, and I was the digital communications advisor to the prime minister. But then when it comes to tools or producing content, or basically the team that you need to be able to execute on your strategy, on your communication strategy, that was contained in a very large administration. It's about 70 people, and the role of that administration is to be basically the communications agency for the government. And one of the first things that we had to deal with was the disconnect, in a way, between the way that organization functioned, which is perfectly functional, but also the way that the speed at which the media cycle and the evolution of public opinion is, at the rate that we know today. It's incredibly fast. You have to be able to monitor social media. You have to be able to measure the evolution of public opinion extremely fast to be able to know and to calibrate how you want to react or not react, or how it can infuse in your communication strategies. You have to be able to produce content extremely rapidly. You have to be able to do it in different formats, obviously thinking digital, thinking of large-scale communications campaigns. And so you come into government, and there was a very strong disconnect between what we needed and the speed at which we needed it and the quality at which we needed it, and the way the administration still functioned. And so one of my largest responsibilities while working for the Prime Minister's office was to completely revamp, that administration, and just in general working to modernize the way that the institutions of in charge of communications at the government level functioned. So that was a big overhaul where we brought in a director for that administration that came from who was a vice president at a major firm from the private sector, which was the first time the administration had somebody who was specifically a digital communications expert from the private sector who came in and did amazing work revamping the organization, recruiting from the outside, because at least in France, when it comes to digital communications, it's not necessarily skills and training tracks that exist in the public sector training. When you're working to become a public servant, it's not like you can train. There's no track to become specifically a public servant working in digital communication. So it's very hard to have the best of the best, without also looking to what's going on in the private sector, changing the way the teams worked, the tools used, etc. So that was a big part of it, and I think that's a really important thing. If you're just coming in, is make sure you have a very thorough idea of what you're working with, and make sure right from the get-go that if you don't have it, you're working to obtain it. Because I think, especially looking at the COVID crisis today, if we hadn't done all of that legwork beforehand, responding to that crisis would have been much more difficult if you weren't able to see, what are the main questions that citizens are asking themselves, with a mix of Google and social media analysis. How can you produce very simple explanatory content that's meant for digital and adapted to every platform extremely rapidly? All of those needs that we all have to respond to the COVID crisis, we weren't ready to meet those needs when we came into office, and doing that job of really having that. We did a complete audit of the way that the communications organizations specific to each ministry and to interministerial work were organized, to make sure that we corrected in the right way, almost immediately when we came in. And that was incredibly important, because you don't want to be asking yourselves those questions in the middle of the crisis. That's stuff that you do way before.
Yves, can I ask a question that
Sure.
When it comes to each EU member state, of course, different platforms are popular. And for example, I'm from Hungary, and in Hungary, Twitter is not particularly popular. But I noticed something, that Edouard Philippe's accounts on Facebook, you have approximately 171,000 followers. And then on Twitter, you have 892,000 followers. So why is it that there's such an imbalance between the Facebook page and the Twitter handle? What was the reason for that?
Well, I'm not sure it has to do with, I'm not sure it has to do with the use of the platforms. Facebook is incredibly popular in France, very used. I think you could also bring it back to, you can obviously talk more broadly about the role of algorithms and the content that's supported. And I think in general, that's a really big question I think that all of us have, and especially working at an EU level. And if I were to boil it down to one question, is how do you make the unsexy sexy? And I think that's probably an issue that we all have, and that would be, to answer your question, Sebastian, a point that's also a big difference between campaigning and governing. Governing is not necessarily sexy. What do you do when your political authority is leading the interministerial committee on logistics? That's not necessarily sexy, but it's incredibly important. And I think we've all had, time to see that in the last few months. So how do you explain that? How do you make it palatable? How do you bring it back down to, if not an individual level, at least a level of understanding that makes sense? How, if your political authority or your government is working with, the plan you're announcing might be billions of euros. What does that mean in billions of euros? That's not palatable to anybody at an individual level. You could say 10 billion, or you could say 100 billion. It's very hard to understand what that means and to answer the question, sure, but what is that going to change for me, for my life, for my city, for my, So I think a lot of the work that's really important and that we try to do, and that I tried to do, was anytime, working very closely with every advisor on the team, was to constantly ask that question, is like, okay, and to kind of work, I would say, if you're going to come into a role in communications in government, I would almost say it's a role as sometimes as a translator. You have these incredibly complex policy issues that are not black and white, that are very nuanced, that are, that don't necessarily have clear-cut, easy answers, and to then make them clear and understandable and engaging, and to make it clear how those issues, even if they feel like they're very far away, actually have important impact on your lives at an individual level, or at the level of your at a local level, for example. And so I think that's a big challenge that you have to face, and that also plays into what kind of content and how you can make content as accessible and as engaging as possible on social media, while also staying true to what you are. In the case of the people that I've worked with, the political leaders that I've worked with, they're incredibly nuanced policy wonks, who have real attention to nuance and detail, and a word does not mean the same as another word. You can't, just round up. You have to be incredibly precise and really appreciate the complexity of each issue. Unfortunately, that's about the exact opposite of what functions on social media. So I think that's also our issue, is how do you stay true to your message while innovating on the format and the way you deliver that message, so that you make the unsexy sexy. And I think that the complexity there, and I think Trump shows us this, is the easy way out, I would say, is to change your message. If what works is an extremist message, make your message extremist. And I would say that is basically the worst thing you could do. And I think the right way to answer that challenge when it comes to us, I think, Simon, you were saying you work at the ECB. We're working with very difficult and complex issues, and staying true to your message and to who you are, or who the political leader that you represent is, staying true to them and staying authentic, while at the same time trying to innovate on the way that you deliver the message, so that it can be heard and cut across, filter bubbles.
Absolutely. If I may for a second, I think you're absolutely right, and finding that balance between staying true to yourself but making yourself understood is very difficult, and we're facing that challenge every day. And I think clearly there is a middle ground between being the policy geek and being Trump. And I'd be curious to hear from you, Eve, perhaps how you have successfully built trust of the policymakers that you worked with, to perhaps agree to some simplification in their message, and in order to become more effective in the digital communications that you do.
That's a really, really great question. I think, back to my point on trying to stay true to your message but innovating in the way you deliver it, I would offer up two examples, one on Facebook Live and one on Twitch. So fairly early on. So the prime minister was named in May. We started a couple months later. We thought about, okay, how can the prime minister engage with citizens in a way that really stays true to what he is and what he wants to do, which is and at the same time, stay true to your message, but to deliver it effectively. And what we came up with was very regular. Every week, the prime minister, for the first time, would answer citizens' questions, either by theme or sometimes open-ended on a variety of topics for half an hour on Facebook Live. And the way we came to this also was, every politician is different, every political leader is different, but was to say, how can we have the most no frills, true, authentic engagement, not an edited video, not a here's the recap of our day and here are the best bits that we show you, but straight, serving it up to you straight and answering questions, even if that sometimes means saying, I don't know, or we haven't gotten to that policy issue yet, or, here's my personal position, but it hasn't become a policy issue that's been presented yet. And so that was one example that really worked for us, was to have him very simply in a very simple setup in his office, hello everyone, and to just start and, not go on for there was no speech. It wasn't, delivering whatever you want to say, but to say, basically, I'm making myself available to explain, straight to you the issue that you might want to talk about. And what became, to your point about simplifying the message, what was really interesting about that exercise is because it was there was no net, there's no aid, because the questions come up live, so you don't know what the questions are going to be, and it's not like you have a speech in front of you. And a couple French media, actually quite a number of French media picked up on this, is the way he expressed himself was, because of that format, because the format also was configured that way, was much more direct, and I don't want to say familiar, but was very different than the words and the way that you express yourself, in a speech, for example, or at a press conference. So it felt much more almost like a conversation, and it could, and that might mean using words like, truc or machin, which are, sorry, I'm saying it in French, so it doesn't really help you understand my point, but stuff instead of, so to just make it much easier to have a conversation. You kind of want to grab a beer and listen along, and the issues stay the same and the message is still the same and the issues are still as complex, but because they're framed by a question that's being asked by a citizen and not necessarily from the point of view of the policymaker, which can be very different, it changes the way that you discuss that same issue. So I think that's an example that goes, to your question, which didn't really require a discussion about simplifying, the speech or the way to present, but simply because the format made it that way. That was the result that we arrived at. And then to be able to repurpose that content in other forms and other short videos after the live was over, made those short videos really good explainers of the issues, much better than if we had used a prompter and written it ourselves. So that's one big example, and I think it really worked for us. We didn't invent the concept, but I think if that works for your political leader, I think that's a really good way of approaching conversations with citizens. And the other example maybe to give was something that we did on Twitch. So to your point, a couple years ago, France went through the Yellow Vest movement, which I think you're probably familiar with, the Gilets jaunes. And at the coming out of that, the response from the government was to put into place what was called le grand débat, the great debate, which was going to be, a never before seen national exercise in listening and participatory democracy, taking input on 4 main topics, ranging from climate change to public spending, to take 2 examples, and to really collect the opinions and thoughts and feedback from basically as much as the French population as possible. And that took a bunch of different forms. There was an online, there was a website, you could also go to City Hall and write in a notebook. This was especially, good for people who weren't necessarily comfortable on the internet, or who were older and who knew where their city hall was. And then those notebooks were given to central government for analysis. But one of the questions we had to answer is, how do you engage the youth in this exercise? Obviously, you can't say that you've engaged, French citizens as a whole if the 16 to 25 haven't taken part in any way. And so what we did, and this was not the only thing, but I think this is a pretty example of what you're saying, was we went to them. And how do you do that is like, where are they engaging the most? And at that time, one of the answers to that question was Twitch. And so we kind of turned around, the normal use of Twitch in a way by partnering with a bunch of young influencers who, talked about a whole bunch of different issues. And what we put together in the end was an 11-hour live session that involved 10 ministers, starting with the prime minister. And they each did about 2-hour-long, basically roundtables, but that were interactive. The point was not only that the people who were there in the, at the roundtable answered, not only the minister and the YouTuber, for example, and a couple young people, but obviously taking in a lot of the questions that were being asked via chat. I think we got more than 50,000 messages, at least for part of the session. So to really be able to have that interactive dimension that was so native to Twitch, and the way that that age range was used to interacting with YouTubers or with gamers, but except that on the other end, it was ministers who were there for a very long period of time. If you've set up any kind of media interview, for example, for a political leader, 2 hours live is not a small amount of time to dedicate to the exercise, and 11 hours live is not is not a short amount of time also. So really adapting to the codes of that platform and of the audience that we were trying to engage, to be able to include them as much as possible in this national debate exercise that was going on countrywide.
I'm so glad you mentioned Twitch, Yves, because it's really catching on in Europe. So one way you can use it is you can play video games, and then if you're a politician, you can talk to voters. So there's actually a German MEP, Timo Wölken, who does this, and he has approximately 16,000 subscribers on Twitch, which I think is impressive. And if you actually go on his European Parliament webpage, his bio has his Twitch account listed, which I've never seen for another MEP. And we actually have an article right now on the European Campaign Playbook blog, which is called 3 Reasons to Join. So I highly recommend our readers check it out afterwards. And what I wanted to ask is, have you seen, and just to put you on the spot here, the so-called Ask the President live video that Ursula von der Leyen does? So the setup is similar. So she gets questions from citizens, and then she answers those questions. And if you've seen it, what do you think about it? And if you haven't seen it, what would you recommend to them?
I haven't seen it.
To give her some time, I actually had a video prepared on this amazing experiment. Not only because it is innovative, but because it was done a few years ago. So let's see if you can see the video, and then we give Eve some time to think. Look. Okay.
constate. Ça me plaît pas, mais je la constate. Je pourrais volontiers vous dire, parce que je le crois très profondément, que la politique est aujourd'hui bien plus propre, entre guillemets, qu'il y a 50 ou 60 ans. C'est pas forcément ce que pensent les gens, mais je peux vous garantir que c'est la vérité. En tout cas, moi, j'en suis absolument convaincu. Les histoires de financement des partis politiques qui étaient monstrueuses il y a 50 ans, c'est des trucs qui ont quasiment...
And we are back. I wish I could, but I think you could see it at the beginning that the setting it was like you could see these millennials with the hoodie asking questions, and he being quite a senior leader, being the prime minister of a country like France, being so approachable. I guess it's also because he's a mayor, right, of a main city. And I think local politics has this strength that politicians who come from a background of local politics, they are way more approachable, more comfortable in the short distance. But then you could see that there was a highlight, but you could see the setting. I really wanted to share it with our audience in case we can give some ideas, right? It could be something as simple as booking a studio, bringing influencers. It can be Twitch, it can be any other platform, and then have a very down-to-earth conversation, honest, with your candidate or with your member of government. So congrats for arranging that. It's quite cool.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. And actually, the guy in the hoodie is Hugo Travers, who's a great guy, who's a YouTuber, who's like the main YouTuber in France that does explanations of the news and political goings on for young people. And actually, the very first thing we did when we came into office was to have a day in the life of the prime minister with Hugo, and that just from what's interesting about that from a tactical perspective, I might say, was we didn't have a YouTube channel. And so when you think of YouTube as, a search engine, what do you want coming up, when the name of your political leader, for example, is searched? And even though that's not not even the main reason that we did that video, which was also an introduction of the prime minister to the youth, to kind of give an idea of how he works and who he is. But the result was also that anytime that you looked for him on YouTube, that would be the first content that appears. So even if we weren't doing the much more energy intensive thing of keeping up your own YouTube channel, you kind of laid the groundwork. And now that video is up. When we started, it was in 2017, it had like 300,000 views, and now I think it's over 1 million, simply because it was there from the get-go, and it's become a reference. So just that was just an aside. Kind of to answer the question. So I haven't seen the Ask Your Questions video from the president, Ask the President video, but I think in general, one thing that I've learned and that we worked really hard on when we were in the Prime Minister's office was how do you answer the issue of distrust, and how do you create engaging content? And I think one of the issues that we all have collectively is we're always putting all our energy and time and focus on the moments where we're announcing new things, because that's what that's how the media cycle works, and very little on the implementation phase. So there's going to be a lot more. You're going to do a whole press conference, and you'll have your press release, etc. When you're announcing your, if I take the EU example, it could be anything, but it's going to be a big plan, and it's going to be, again, probably a big budget, and it's going to mean a lot to political stakeholders. But then when that phase is actually when that plan is actually being implemented, we're not necessarily going to hear about it as much. And I think one of the efforts that we worked on, and I think is very pertinent to talk about at the EU level, is to really shift that focus to how can we really follow along the implementation of what we're working on, and show, not just talk about it, not just like, do videos and announce and explain, but show it happening. If you're going to talk about, one simple example is like internet being installed in even the farthest village in France. Well, don't just say, internet will be here, for you in 3 months, but really go there, be there, when it's being installed, and show, how the phone, how it goes from 0 to, okay, now I'm online, here we go. And we had this, there's a great example that I think of. It wasn't actually us. It was from the administration that was in charge of the project, showing, this producer, this agriculture, who could now have his marketing website where he sold like these really prized chickens. And he couldn't do that before because he didn't have the internet. So it really changed his business model. It changed, his individual economic situation. And it's much more interesting to focus on that individual story than to just stop once you've announced the nationwide plan. And so I think there's a lot that we can do really going, and it's really hard. I think from a government perspective, especially if you're in central government, you don't have direct access to that individual level story. You have to work really well with your administrations. You have to build kind of those pipelines to make sure that information gets all the way to you. And every government is different, but that was definitely a challenge. But that's really what matters, is how are you, effectively changing people's lives, and how are you showing that?
And here I have to say, I think there's a best practice example, if I may say so. In Hungary, there's an MP by the name of János Lázár János. And he announced a tram train project between the city of Szeged and Hódmezővásárhely. And, it's very difficult to communicate such a project, right? Rural trains, how can you make this interesting? As you said, Eve, sexy. And I think they did something very provocative, which is they show the traditional, suit and tie. Here's the, tram train project. We're building it. Next video, here's the construction. Third video, it's starting. And in the third video, what they do is, once the train starts, he steps away from the microphone and he says, "This is a really big fucking thing." And I pardon my bad language here, but he said that in the video purposefully so that it's recorded. And so the next day, the entire media cycle was all over it, that, the conservative MP, János Lázár, swore on tape. But what did he reach? He managed to get everybody talking about this tram train project. It was on every front page of every online news site in Hungary. So mission accomplished. Sometimes you got to reach into the dirty words toolbox, I'd say.
I will not deny the ability of the Hungarians to make it in the news recently. Okay. Joke aside, that was great, because in my day-to-day, I have like this very tight agenda, and we go through one by one and then on to the next thing. But here we didn't respect it at all, which is, I love it. But we touch upon a lot of things in a very dynamic way. I loved it. There are people asking on social media, but because we always want to keep this digital lunch very on schedule and be only 1 hour so that we can continue with our work. I'm gonna bring up one of the comments by Eduardo, which, by the way, there she is. Thank you, and we thank you, Eve. How do you keep volunteers engaged and committed to the campaign and cause? I think we touched upon a little bit at the beginning when we were mentioning the Obama campaign and how you brought it back home to France. So Eduardo, make sure that you watch it again. Go to the beginning, because she gave really good insights. The last thing that I'm going to do to wrap it up.
Maybe just to add to that really briefly.
Sure.
treat your volunteers well. Make sure that if you're putting out calls to action, you have people, inside your campaign who are ready to answer those emails, those messages, those letters, and who, make sure that those volunteers or people who are interested in the campaign are not just speaking into an empty void, and that you have a process in place to include them, to answer them, and to get them engaged. So treat your volunteers well, and then obviously there's more advice at the beginning of the video, but that's a really important point.
Great. And the last thing that I wanted to say is something that we always do with our guests, which is whether they can recommend us a book that they've read recently, a movie, anything like that. But more especially, I wanted to ask you a question. You've been in government, you've been in campaign. Often we think that being in government is like the dream, but is it really the dream? Is it a dream? Is it a nightmare? Would you go back again? Just share us this last thought, and then we can wrap it up.
It's a really easy question. It's not about being in or out of government, but who you're there with. I think the wrong thing to do is to obsess about getting in and, not looking at why you want to go, to do what, and with whom, which, I'm sure this is common to all our countries, definitely exists. Don't make it an obsession to check that off in your resume. In my case, I was going in with, working for a man that probably the person I admire most, and going in with a team that I had already worked with for 2 years, because a lot of them were coming in from the campaign. So, we had already gone through basically everything together. So we're really, really tight team. And I think, just generally the team of 60 people that I worked with is just an incredible team of incredibly smart, dedicated people that, we all still keep in touch very frequently. So, and the most important thing is we believe in the person we were working for, and even more importantly, we believe in what we were there to do, and we knew why we were there. So I think if you have those three things, then you're all set.
And I think that you nailed it. It really resonated with me personally. Let me tell you, these last few words, you are absolutely right. And well, with that, I wanted to thank Simon and Denesh for joining us.
Great meeting you guys.
And thank you, Eve, for accepting to join us. This is what we do every Friday. So I at least have a lot of fun chatting with you. Hope it was the same. And yeah, we will come across each other in the future, I'm pretty sure. Good luck.
Thanks so much. This was really great. Thanks for having me.
Bon courage.
Merci.